Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Tino Fiumara, the quiet but commanding force whose sharp mind and iron discipline helped shape the underworld from the shadows of New Jersey's waterfront. Before we begin, make sure to like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes. And don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Tino Fiumara guide you into the night. The cranes along the New Jersey shore moved like slow metal skeletons against the night sky, lifting containers the size of small houses and swinging them over the black water. Truck engines rumbled in long lines, chains clinked, radios crackled in a dozen languages, and the air smelled of diesel, salt, and rust. Somewhere in that maze of steel and concrete, a stocky, middle-aged man in a plain jacket walked alone, taking everything in with quick, measuring glances. Most people on the docks that night did not know his name. They might have noticed the way men twice his size stepped a little lighter when he passed, or how foremen straightened their shoulders when they caught sight of him. They might have noticed that when he spoke, people listened, that certain disputes somehow never reached the union office but still got resolved. They only knew that trouble never lasted long when he was around, and that the smart ones kept his face in mind and his name off their tongues. Behind a chain-link fence across the yard, a pair of federal agents leaned in a parked car, coffee cooling in cardboard cups, watching the endless motion of the port. They knew exactly who he was. To them, he was a long-standing name in thick case files, a figure in surveillance photos that stretched back decades, a man whose quiet influence touched hiring lists, shipping companies, trucking firms, and bars blocks away from the waterfront. One of the agents, tracing circles on a notepad, muttered that every time they built a case, this man slipped away again. The man moving through the shadows was Tino Fiumara. To understand how he came to stroll those piers with that calm, wary confidence, you have to go back to another Newark, another time, when the port still loaded cargo by hand and a teenager named Tino was only beginning to learn what the waterfront could give a clever, ruthless young man and what it would eventually take away. He was born in 1941, in a Newark that was crowded, noisy, and still full of people trying to find their place after the upheaval of war. His family was part of the Italian-American community that had taken root in the city, where the streets were a mix of churches, corner grocery stores, bars, row houses, and factories. Kids played stickball in alleys. Women carried shopping bags upstairs that never seemed to end. Men came home with grease, dust, or coal on their clothes. The harbor was never far from anyone's thoughts. The docks and warehouses offered jobs when factories closed, and the promise of steady pay drew men toward the piers. Work there was hard, and rules were not always written in any book. Who got hired, who waited at the gate, who spent the day hoping for a call that never came, those choices often depended on people whose authority did not come from elections or company titles. Stories about those figures floated through the neighborhood. Children heard older relatives drop certain names with a mix of resentment and respect. Everybody knew there were men who could help you get work, solve a problem, or make a debt disappear, but only if you accepted that you would never really be free of them afterward. In that world, a boy who paid attention could see early how influence really worked. Most of what is known about Tino's early years comes from later law enforcement files and secondhand memories. People who knew him as a teenager sometimes described him as quiet, watchful, someone who listened more than he spoke. He was not a flashy neighborhood tough. He did not boast loudly at bars or start fights for show. That restraint would become part of his reputation later. A man who weighed every word, every gesture. As he grew older, the streets around him were changing. The old Italian, Irish, and Polish blocks mixed with newcomers. Some families moved to the suburbs. Tensions rose, jobs shifted, and for the kids left behind, opportunities looked uncertain. For some, school led to steady work and a safe life. For others, fast money and dangerous company seemed more real than any classroom. By the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, federal agencies tracking organized crime had begun to focus more seriously on the New Jersey waterfront. They knew that the powerful Genovese crime family from New York had long treated the docks as one of its most important territories. Through influence in the International Longshoremen's Association and related unions, mob figures steered jobs, skimmed from shipping contracts, and demanded regular payments from companies and workers who wanted the piers to run smoothly. In this environment, a young man who understood both the streets and the docks could become very useful. Investigators later said that during these years, Tino began spending time around older Genovese associates who had deep roots on the piers. Instead of hanging out on corners just to pass the time, he gravitated toward the berry-bulb back rooms of bars near the water, where small meetings took place away from casual ears. Those circles valued loyalty, silence, and reliability. A person who could carry a message, collect money, or pass along instructions without talking out of turn was more valuable than any loud show-off. From the scattered remarks that surfaced in later FBI reports, Tino showed early that he understood that code. He did not brag. He did not draw unnecessary attention. He did what was asked, remembered what he saw, and kept his own counsel. The Genovese family at that time was already one of the most powerful organized crime groups in the country. It had a structure, a boss at the top, underboss, consigliere, then capo regimes who ran individual crews. New Jersey, especially the Newark and Bayonne waterfronts, fell under the influence of one of those crews. Whoever controlled that territory could tap into shipping, trucking, warehouses, and union locals in ways that brought in steady, often quiet streams of money. By the mid-1960s, Tino's name began turning up in intelligence summaries that law enforcement agencies circulated internally. He was noted not as a leader, but as a trusted figure within the Genovese network in New Jersey. He had connections to longshoremen and union officials, as well as to bookmakers and people involved in illicit lending. That mixture labor, gambling, credit was not accidental. It reflected the way organized crime wove itself into both the official and unofficial economies of the port. Labor racketeering on the docks did not usually involve loud confrontations. More often, it worked through quiet pressure. A company might discover that its cargo was being delayed, that paperwork kept getting misplaced, that workers seemed oddly unmotivated. Then someone would arrive with a suggestion, a small arrangement, a consulting fee, a contribution that would make problems vanish. On the other side, longshoremen who wanted regular work often found that their names moved up or down hiring lists based on their willingness to cooperate with that same network of influence. According to later federal indictments, Tino became one of the men who helped manage these pressures. He represented, in practical terms, the interests of higher-ranking Genovese figures, while maintaining close contact with union officers and foremen. When payments were owed, he was part of the chain that ensured they were collected. When a trucking firm resisted, he was among those who would talk to the owners until they changed their minds. These activities were unlawful extortion, conspiracy, interference with union operations, but they unfolded slowly and often without open threats. That subtlety made such schemes hard to prosecute. It also let men like Tino remain less visible to the general public than flashier mob figures in big city headlines. In Newark and the neighboring port towns, the name Tino carried weight in certain circles, yet most citizens would have walked past him on the street without a second glance. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, federal and state agencies stepped up their efforts to expose corruption on the waterfront. The success of earlier investigations into other unions showed that patient work wiretaps, undercover informants, financial records could reveal the hidden structure of organized crime influence. Teams of agents watched hiring halls, listened to pay phones, and quietly approached men who seemed ready to talk. They learned that money collected from the docks did not stay there. Funds flowed up through various intermediaries to Genovese captains and, eventually, to the family's leadership. Illegal gambling operations in New Jersey bars, high-interest loans to struggling small business owners, and kickbacks from contract awards all fed the same network. Names like Tino's stood out as part of the New Jersey branch that kept those channels running. Within that world, Tino's position continued to grow. He gained a tenors in LibriVox.hum, reputation for being calm in tense negotiations. If a company executive wavered, he would sit across from them at a small table, speaking in a low, steady voice, making clear without needing to raise it that there were better and worse ways of doing business on the docks. Workers who complained about favoritism in hiring might find themselves pulled aside by someone answering to him, warned that making too much noise could be bad for their safety and their paychecks. Workers, companies, and even local politicians sometimes accepted this arrangement out of fear, sometimes out of a belief that it was simply how the port operated. The harm it caused was real, though it rarely made front-page news. Honest longshoremen lost chances at fair advancement. Businesses that refused to go along found themselves squeezed or driven away. Legitimate union voices were weakened by the quiet presence of people answering to organized crime. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement had enough information to begin stitching together a more complete picture. Undercover informants described meetings in diners and social clubs where payments were counted out or disputes settled. Wiretaps picked up coded conversations about dues, insurance, and problems that needed attention. Many of these recordings did not capture direct instructions, but they showed patterns. Who called whom, who traveled where, who met in which back room after which shipment arrived. In those patterns, Tino's importance became harder to ignore. He was no longer just a go-between. Investigators concluded that in New Jersey, he was serving as a key organizer for Genovese interests, especially on the Bayonne and Newark piers. He had the trust of higher-ranking figures in New York and the obedience of men on the ground in New Jersey. His influence extended to certain union locals whose leadership cooperated with him in steering contracts and hiring. This growing prominence drew more intense attention. Federal prosecutors, pressured to show progress in the long fight against organized crime, wanted a major case that would not only convict individual mobsters, but also expose how deeply they had penetrated the waterfront. They looked at the web of names: union officers, businessmen, reputed mob figures, and saw Tino near the center of several strands. Gathering evidence against someone who spoke rarely and avoided obvious displays was not easy. Friends and associates had learned that loose talk could bring them before a grand jury or land them in witness protection. Some stayed silent out of fear, others out of loyalty. But slowly, through flipped union officials, careful recording of financial flows, and patient observation, investigators assembled an indictment that reached from the piers to the back rooms of social clubs. In that legal document, unsealed near the end of the 1970 seconds, prosecutors laid out a picture of the New Jersey waterfront as they believed it really worked. They described extortion schemes that required shipping companies to make regular secret payments to ensure labor peace. They detailed how certain longshoremen's union locals had become tools of the Genovese family, with hiring lists manipulated at the direction of mob associates. They named Tino as one of the key participants in these rackets, a man whose role involved coordinating collections, enforcing discipline, and protecting the interests of his criminal superiors. For years, he had moved through the piers as a quiet, controlling presence, seemingly untouchable. Now he faced the possibility that the slow weight of federal evidence would finally pin him down. As he sat in court, listening while prosecutors described the world behind the cranes and cargo holds, the question hanging in the air was whether this time the government had done enough to break the shield of silence that had surrounded him for so long. The courtroom felt colder than it should have for a late summer afternoon. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and every cough or scrape of a chair echoed off the high ceiling. Reporters sat with notepads open, pens ready, but even they seemed to hold their breaths as the judge shuffled papers on the bench. At the defense table, wearing a plain suit, sat the man many of those agents had followed through rain, snow, and long nights on the docks. No big reaction, no outburst. His hands were folded, his expression steady. Behind him, a few relatives and longtime associates watched in silence, understanding that whatever was about to be said would shape not only his life, but theirs. When the judge finally spoke, the words were formal and practiced: charges, counts, statutory language, but underneath, everyone heard the real message. Years. Not months. Not some short token stretch. A long sentence for racketeering, extortion, and related crimes tied to his control over unions and shipping companies. As the numbers rolled out, some people in the back glanced at each other. These walls, those bars, the steel fences outside, they were about to close in on someone who had spent much of his adult life operating in spaces where nothing was written down and everything was understood. The man barely moved as the decision landed. It was not in his nature to react dramatically in front of strangers. He listened, nodded once, and waited while the judge finished speaking. Only when the gavel came down and the courtroom began to stir did he allow himself a brief look around the room, as if taking a mental picture for later. This was where decades of quiet influence on the waterfront had brought him. The name on the case was Tino Fiumara. To prosecutors, this conviction was the payoff for years of work. The indictment had charged him and others with using their power over longshoremen's union locals in New Jersey to pressure shipping and trucking companies. According to the government, they had demanded regular hidden payments to keep operations running smoothly, to avoid strikes or slowdowns, and to ensure that labor disputes never turned into full-blown crises. The companies that resisted found cargo delayed, trucks held up, or paperwork suddenly mishandled. Federal law treated these schemes as serious organized crime offenses. Under statutes designed to dismantle racketeering networks, the case went beyond simple extortion. The jury had heard about an ongoing pattern: use of union influence for criminal purposes, interference in legitimate collective bargaining, secret deals that kept honest workers from having truly independent representation. The aim, prosecutors said, was profit for the Genovese family and the people who managed its affairs on the docks. Fiumara's lawyers argued that he was just a union man in a rough environment, someone who handled problems the way things had always been handled. They hinted that the government had turned every phone call, every handshake near the piers into something sinister. But the paper trail, the cooperative witnesses, and the recorded conversations about payments, arrangements, and insurance persuaded the jury that what was happening went far beyond typical labor hardball. When the verdict came back guilty, law enforcement officials saw it as one of the most important blows delivered against organized crime on the New Jersey waterfront. For the first time, a man regarded as a key organizer for the Genovese family's interests in that region faced a lengthy prison term. The sentencing that followed confirmed it. 2 decades or more behind bars, depending on parole. For many people who worked on the docks, the news was received with mixed feelings. Some longshoremen, who had spent years watching hiring lists bend to the will of unseen decision-makers, quietly hoped this might open the way for a fairer system. Others, who had found a kind of security in the predictability of that shadow control, worried about what would come next. One thing was clear: a familiar presence was about to disappear from the piers. Prison for a man like Fiumara was both punishment and test. By the time he entered the federal system in the early 1982, he was already known as a solid, trusted figure in the Genovese family's New Jersey branch. The question, for his superiors and his peers, was whether he would remain loyal under the pressure of a long sentence, or whether he would become one of the growing number of mob figures who chose to cooperate with the government. From everything that later emerged, he stayed silent. There were no reports of him turning witness, no sudden sealed testimonies with his name on them. Instead, he accepted his fate as part of the life he had chosen. For authorities, that made him both a frustrating adversary and, in a way, a predictable one. Inside, he encountered other men from the same world, figures from different families, from nearby cities, even from rival factions within his own organization. Prison yards and visiting rooms became, in some ways, unofficial meeting spaces where news traveled and alliances shifted. Yet his personality remained consistent. Cautious, reserved, more inclined to listen than to hold court. Outside, the world he had left behind was changing. The 1980 brought an unprecedented wave of federal pressure on traditional organized crime families. Newly aggressive use of racketeering laws, combined with sophisticated surveillance and a growing number of defectors, began to erode some of the old structures. High-profile bosses and underbosses went to trial. Informants sat in witness boxes and described, in plain language, ceremonies, rules, murders, and money flows that had once been known only behind closed doors. The Genovese family, long considered the most disciplined and cautious of the New York organizations, responded by becoming even more secretive. Instead of one strong public boss, it relied on panels, intermediaries, and layers of insulation to keep law enforcement guessing. On the New Jersey side, other figures stepped in to manage the waterfront and related rackets in Tino's absence. But his influence did not vanish entirely. Prison mail and monitored phone calls revealed that he still received respect from his old circle. Visitors brought word of who was up and who was down, which companies were proving stubborn, which union officials were under investigation. While his ability to direct specific actions was limited, his very survival as a respected inmate mattered. In that culture, serving time without breaking was its own form of currency. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued to revisit his earlier activities, using them to build cases against others. The original labor racketeering case that sent him away became a model for new investigations. Agents who had worked on his file trained younger colleagues, explaining how subtle shifts in hiring patterns or sudden changes in contract awards could signal unseen pressure. The harm caused by the corrupt systems he had helped maintain did not magically end with his imprisonment. Unions that had been influenced by the Genovese family remained vulnerable to new figures stepping into the same roles. Companies that had quietly paid consulting fees for years sometimes simply found themselves dealing with different names at the other end of the table. But the conviction did have symbolic power. It showed that even men who avoided headlines and kept a low profile could end up wearing inmate numbers. Through the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds, as he moved through the federal system, parole boards and wardens saw a middle-aged man with a relatively clean disciplinary record, but with a background that made every decision about him sensitive. Law enforcement feared that once released, he would return to the same environment, using his experience and connections to rebuild criminal networks that earlier cases had damaged. By the time serious talk of parole began, the waterfront had changed yet again. Containerization had reshaped shipping. New management practices and technology altered how work was assigned and performed. Yet the basic vulnerabilities remained. Unions with real power over logistics, companies under pressure to keep cargo moving, and individuals willing to exploit both sides. When Fiumara was finally released from federal custody after serving a large part of his sentence, the world outside did not look exactly the way it had when he went in. The neighborhoods he knew in Newark and around the ports had seen waves of upheaval. Some old bars and social clubs were gone, replaced by new businesses or boarded-up storefronts. Younger faces had taken over many operations. He returned under supervision, with parole conditions that formally restricted his contact with known organized crime figures. On paper, he was just another exu inmate expected to find a lawful path. In reality, both law enforcement and the underworld watched him closely. One side waited to see whether he would try to reclaim a central role. The other wanted to know if the years inside had diminished his standing. Investigators later concluded that he did not fade quietly into retirement. Instead, over time, he resumed contact with the network that had sustained him. The Genovese family, which valued continuity and trusted proven loyalists, reportedly gave him significant responsibility in New Jersey once more. Some accounts from law enforcement sources described him as a key figure in the family's operations across the Hudson, involved not only in the waterfront but also in other rackets, illegal gambling, high-interest lending, and schemes reaching into construction and waste hauling. Any suggestion that he simply walked back into his old position ignores the complexity of those years. Other powerful men had filled the vacuum during his imprisonment. There were internal disputes, shifting alliances, and quiet tests of strength. Yet Tino's combination of experience, reputation for reliability, and long-standing relationships with union and business contacts helped him carve out a renewed place in the hierarchy. For federal agents who had spent careers battling organized crime, the news that he was again a presence on the piers felt like a bitter echo of the past. Younger investigators found themselves studying old case files from the 1,970 seconds to understand the man they were now assigned to follow. Wiretaps, physical surveillance, and confidential informants once again began tracking his movements from his home to quiet restaurants, from union-related offices to social clubs that tried to look unremarkable from the outside. One agent later described him as someone who had learned from the old mistakes. Quote, he avoided obvious meetings with notorious figures. He preferred brief, controlled conversations, often in places where background noise made recordings difficult. He did not, according to these accounts, boast or drink heavily in public. Instead, he maintained the same cautious, low-key style that had carried him so far before his first arrest. Still, evidence mounted that his return to the streets was not a clean break from his past. Companies in and around the ports reported pressure that felt familiar to older executives. Some longshoremen whispered that hiring lists were once again being influenced by people who never appeared on any official organizational chart. Investigators watching financial flows saw patterns that matched classic racketeering, money moving in ways that did not line up with legitimate business activity. For parole officers and federal prosecutors, this created a dilemma. They had a man on supervised release who seemed connected to renewed criminal activity, yet proving direct involvement in court required more than suspicion. Building a new case meant revisiting methods from earlier decades. Patient, thorough work that would stand up before a judge. In the late 1990 seconds, that work began to pay off. Federal authorities moved again, this time not only targeting his earlier role, but also examining whether he had violated the conditions of his release and engaged in fresh offenses linked to extortion and control over union-linked businesses. The picture that emerged, from their perspective, was of someone who had used his freedom not to rebuild his life legally, but to reassert influence in the same unlawful systems that had already cost him so many years. Once more, his name appeared in indictments and press releases, tied to schemes that harmed both workers and honest companies. Once more, the quiet man who preferred the edges of the frame was pulled back under the harsh lighting of a federal courtroom, facing allegations that, despite age and experience, he had chosen a familiar road back into the shadows of the waterfront. The second time he sat at a defense table in a federal courtroom, he was older, heavier around the middle, his hair thinning and more gray than dark. Yet the posture, the way he held his shoulders and watched everyone without seeming to move his eyes, had not changed much since the first trial years earlier. The calendar had flipped deep into the 1990 seconds. He had already served a long stretch after that first conviction tied to corruption on the New Jersey piers. He had walked out of prison with conditions hanging over his head. No contact with known felons. No involvement in unions or businesses that could bring him back into the same trouble. Regular check-ins with parole officers. On the paperwork, it all looked clear. In reality, it was never going to be that simple. When he came home after so many years, the neighborhoods near the docks looked different. Container yards were more automated, security gates tighter. Old hiring halls either shut down or remodeled. Some of the social clubs he had once frequented were gone, replaced by nail salons, discount stores, or simply empty windows. The faces of the dock workers had changed too, more diverse, more wary of the word union after so many headlines about investigations. But the underlying pressures remained. Cargo still had to move. Shipping lines still needed labor peace. Workers still wanted steady jobs and fair treatment. All of that meant there was still room for the same shadow structures he had known in his youth, if someone was determined enough to rebuild them. Law enforcement officers monitoring his release watched for signs of that determination. Early on, he appeared to live quietly. He settled in a suburban house, kept his schedule modest, drove without drawing attention. Parole reports described routine visits, no violations, a man who knew how closely he was being watched. Then small things began to trouble investigators. A meeting in a restaurant with a man they recognized from old wiretaps. A brief conversation outside a union-linked office with someone on a list of Genovese family associates. A pattern of stops at coffee shops and diners near the ports, never too long, always with different people. Individually, none of these encounters proved much. But people who had studied him for decades knew his style. He had never been the kind to hold loud court in the middle of a crowded bar. His influence always moved quietly, through private conversations and subtle pressures. If he was back in contact with the old network, they suspected, it would look exactly like this. Federal prosecutors eventually decided they had enough to act not yet for a grand new racketeering case, but for violating conditions of supervised release. They argued that he had resumed associating with known members of organized crime and had involved himself indirectly in waterfront matters from which he was supposed to stay away. In the hearing that followed, they laid out surveillance photos, logs of meetings, and testimony from agents who had followed him car length by car length. His defense maintained that he was simply reconnecting with people from his old neighborhood, that it was impossible for him to walk through certain parts of New Jersey without encountering familiar faces who happened also to have criminal records. The judge listened, weighed parole conditions against the world he came from, and ultimately sided with the government. Whatever the explanations, the pattern was too close to his past behavior to ignore. The decision came down. His release would be revoked. He would go back behind bars. For someone who had already spent much of his adult life in custody, returning was both bitter and oddly familiar. He knew the routines, counts, searches, lines for meals better than many guards. To younger inmates just arriving, he was a reminder of an older era. A man from the years when organized crime families still held decisive sway over unions and political machines in certain cities. Inside, his reputation followed him. Other prisoners, especially those with ties to the same world, understood that this was not a low-wallable figure. He had been a key operator for the Genovese family in New Jersey, trusted with major sources of income. That history gave him a measure of status, even when he wore the same standard-issue clothing and stood in the same chow lines as everyone else. Authorities believed that, from his cell, he remained a symbolic leader for the New Jersey branch of the family. Contacts during visits, coded letters, and carefully phrased phone calls carried updates back and forth. Investigators later said that certain union leaders and longshoremen still spoke of him with deference, even though he could not meet with them in person. On the outside, the Genovese family continued to adapt. It remained one of the most cautious, organized crime groups in the country, favoring low profiles and steady income over flashy brutality. Leadership moved through panels and acting figures designed to shield high-ranking members from direct exposure. Within that structure, New Jersey operations were still vital. The docks, trucking companies, construction projects, and waste-hauling firms in the region all offered ways to collect money regularly. Illegal gambling and high-interest lending ran alongside those rackets, feeding off the same network of contacts. Men who had once taken orders from Tino now had to make decisions in his absence, but many still saw themselves as holding his seat for him. During this second period in federal custody, his name surfaced repeatedly in other people's cases. In indictments against union officials on the East Coast, he was sometimes described as a long-standing Genovese captain with historic control over certain locals of the International Longshoremen's Association. Witnesses who had chosen to cooperate with the government told grand juries about meetings where his name was invoked to encourage obedience or justify questionable decisions. Investigators examining corruption in the ILA heard stories of how influence worked on the ground. Union officers would be pressured to steer jobs, support particular candidates in internal elections, or ensure that certain companies got favorable contract terms. Payments moved quietly, sometimes labeled as consulting fees, sometimes in cash. When someone on the inside resisted, they were reminded that the man ultimately backing these demands had spent decades proving he would not bend under pressure. Those accounts deepened the picture of his role, even if they did not immediately lead to new personal charges against him. They showed how the web of influence he had helped weave around the New Jersey docks stretched far beyond a handful of conversations in a hiring hall. It touched the way entire port terminals were run, the careers of honest union members, and the competitive landscape for shipping firms. Throughout, the crimes remained fundamentally economic at their core: extortion, illegal control of unions, manipulation of legitimate businesses. Violence lurked in the background as an implied risk. Workers and company officials understood, without having to see it directly, that defiance could bring trouble. Yet in courtrooms and official reports, the focus stayed on the financial schemes and abuse of labor structures, not on explicit acts of physical harm. After several more years, his time under that revocation order ran out. In the mid-2000s, he walked out once again, now in his mid-60s. The man who emerged was visibly older. His steps were slower. In some surveillance images from that period, he appeared with a cane, a heavy coat, and the rounded shoulders of someone who had lived long with stress and confinement. Federal agents did not treat him as an elderly retiree. They knew that within organized crime circles, age could enhance authority. A seasoned figure who had endured multiple prison terms without cooperating, who had been part of waterfront rackets since the 1960 seconds, carried a certain aura. Younger associates, many of whom had grown up hearing his name, were inclined to treat him almost like an elder statesman. Publicly available law enforcement assessments from those years painted him as a ranking captain in the Genovese family, if not more. Some reports suggested he played a role on a committee that helped guide the family's overall direction during periods when the official boss faced legal trouble. In New Jersey, he was widely believed to be the key overseer of activities stretching from the ports to construction sites and waste management companies. The influence over longshore unions remained a central concern. Investigations into ILA locals in New Jersey and New York turned up evidence that Genovese family figures still shaped leadership choices and contract negotiations. In some cases, union stewards or officers pleaded guilty to charges related to accepting bribes, embezzling funds, or aiding extortion schemes. In plea agreements, prosecutors and judges sometimes described them as operating under the sway of higher-ranking mobsters. His name appeared in such documents as a reference point, a symbol of the kind of control the Genovese family had historically exerted over the docks. Though he was not always charged in those specific cases, authorities wanted the public to understand that the pressure on unions did not come from a single corrupt official, but from a long-standing criminal system. In addition to labor racketeering, investigators believed he oversaw more traditional underworld businesses, sports betting operations run through bars and social clubs, card games where the house cut flowed back to his crew, and loan sharking that trapped desperate borrowers in cycles of debt. Again, details in court records focused on the structure rather than sensational elements. Customers who fell behind on payments might be visited by collectors who reminded them of obligations and the consequences of non-payment, but the official documents describe these interactions mainly as part of financial coercion, not as headline e-grabbing brutality. Some law enforcement sources also linked his name, carefully and often with qualifiers, to unsolved disappearances and suspected killings within organized crime. One such case involved a Genovese associate connected to waterfront rackets who vanished during internal disputes over money and authority. Rumors among underworld figures, later echoed by investigators, suggested that the decision to remove that associate might have been approved or encouraged by men in Tino's circle. He was never charged with homicide. No jury ever heard direct evidence tying him to a specific act of lethal violence. The talk stayed in investigative notes, off-record comments, and the murky realm of underworld gossip. Still, for agents who had watched the waterfront for decades, it fit a familiar pattern. Leadership figures who kept their hands off the most visible acts, while benefiting from the climate of intimidation such acts created. Daily life for him in these later years mixed mundane routines with constant vigilance. He lived in a comfortable but not ostentatious house in the New Jersey suburbs, drove modest cars, and appeared in public mostly at neighborhood restaurants, quiet clubs, and family gatherings. Photographs taken by surveillance teams often showed him sitting at the end of a table, listening while others spoke, then leaning in briefly to offer short, decisive comments. He avoided modern habits that could expose him. He did not, as far as investigators could tell, use email or carry a cell phone regularly. He preferred landlines and face-to-face encounters. He knew that any car could hold a hidden microphone, any diner could have an informant 3 booths away, any telephone could be tapped with a judge's approval. Even with that caution, federal and state agencies continued to gather material. The Waterfront Commission of New York Harbor, a bi-state body created decades earlier to fight corruption, kept close watch on ILA locals believed to be under organized crime influence. They challenged the licensing of certain individuals, blocked some from working in sensitive roles, and shared information with prosecutors building broader racketeering cases. Again and again, his name surfaced as someone whose approval or displeasure still carried weight. Some suspected that no major decision involving the New Jersey Piers Union leadership changes, large contract talks, significant new ventures occurred without at least indirect consultation with the aging Genovese captain. At the same time, his health began to deteriorate. Long years of stress, confinement, and the natural wear of age took their toll. Agents who had once followed him jogging up courthouse steps now recorded him moving more slowly, occasionally leaning heavily on railings. For them, it was a visible reminder that even the most enduring figures in their case files were mortal, yet his legal troubles were never fully over. He remained on the radar for potential future prosecutions. Each new investigation into union corruption, each fresh case involving gambling or loan sharking in New Jersey, prompted the same question among prosecutors. Could this finally be the moment to tie him personally, with courtroom-ready evidence, to another set of charges? So far, his story had been defined by 2 long stays in federal custody, repeated references in other people's indictments, and a reputation that far exceeded the number of times he had actually stood before a jury. He had done serious damage to the integrity of unions and businesses on the waterfront, even if much of that damage was described in documents that never made the front page. As the 2000s advanced, the man who once walked the docks as a younger enforcer now moved mostly through quiet streets, trailed discreetly by unmarked cars. To the neighbors who saw him taking out trash or picking up a newspaper, he might have looked like any other aging resident. To the agents watching from a distance, he remained a central figure in one of the longest-running battles between law enforcement and organized crime on the East Coast, a reminder that the story of the New Jersey waterfront was still not finished. On quiet residential streets far from the glare of container cranes, Unmarked sedans sometimes sat for hours with their lights off, windows cracked, radios low. Inside, agents passed time with lukewarm coffee, watching a narrow driveway or the glow from a single kitchen window. By the early 2000s, the house they watched most often belonged to the same figure who had been appearing in their reports for decades. Age had slowed his steps, but not the attention he drew. To neighbors, he was another older man who left early, came home late, and kept his lawn neat. To the investigators rotating through surveillance shifts, he was still the New Jersey face of the Genovese family, Tino Fiumara. This time, they were not only tracking who he met, but trying to understand whether he had resumed the very patterns of extortion and control that had sent him away before. When he had stepped out of federal custody again, he had done so under strict terms, conditions meant to keep him away from unions, shipping firms, and other environments he had once exploited. At first, outwardly, he behaved like a man determined not to go back. He lived in that suburban home, saw relatives, went to medical appointments, attended the occasional family gathering at small restaurants. He avoided some of the old haunts around the docks that agents thought he might gravitate toward. Yet for people in his world, the pull of the waterfront remained strong. The New York, New Jersey ports were still among the busiest in the country. Containers flowed in endless rows. Every delay cost money. Every contract for loading, unloading, trucking, repairing, and guarding cargo represented opportunity. Law enforcement later said that, quietly and carefully, he slipped back into that world. He did not show up at union halls. He did not lead loud meetings. Instead, investigators claimed, he worked through intermediaries, longtime associates, trusted messengers, and union officers who already understood what was expected without needing detailed instructions. A new wave of federal inquiries into the International Longshoremen's Association and related businesses began to reveal familiar patterns. Trucking companies at Port Newark and Elizabeth reported, behind closed doors, that they were under pressure to make regular off-the-books payments. Container maintenance firms and building contractors around the ports experienced similar demands. The message was never formally written down, but it was clear enough. Pay to avoid trouble, or watch your operations suffer. Behind those pressures, authorities believed, stood the same network that had controlled ILA locals in the 1,970 seconds. Men tied to the Genovese family allegedly leaned on union leaders, who in turn used their official power over hiring and work assignments to send a signal cooperate with the arrangements or face slowdowns, complaints, and constant friction. By 2002, federal prosecutors in New Jersey decided they had gathered enough to act. A new indictment named Fiumara and several co-defendants. It charged them under federal extortion laws and anti-racketeering statutes, accusing them of using the threat of union-driven disruption to force companies to make secret payments. The document described a plan that stretched from waterfront trucking to construction work tied to port facilities, and made it clear that the government saw this not as a few isolated shakedowns, but as part of an ongoing organized crime system. The evidence included accounts from business owners who had decided, after years of fear, to cooperate. Some had met men who hinted at labor problems that could be avoided for a price. Others had watched as their trucks sat idle while competitors' vehicles moved freely, until someone arrived offering to fix things for a regular fee. There were also insiders from the union world who, facing their own charges, chose to testify about meetings where expectations were laid out. One admitted taking money himself and passing a cut up the chain. Another described how company representatives would be steered towards certain consultants when they wanted to win peace on the piers. In the center of this web, prosecutors placed Fiumara. They portrayed him as the ultimate beneficiary, the man whose long-standing reputation on the docks gave weight to every implied threat. Even if he did not personally speak to many of the companies involved, his name, according to witnesses, was quietly invoked to make sure everyone understood that refusal was not wise. For Tino, this new case came on top of parole issues that had already sent him back into custody. He was by then in his early 60s, no longer the street-level figure who had once walked the Newark piers as a younger enforcer, but a senior mob captain with decades of history. Facing this combination of fresh charges and his record, he had a choice. Go to trial and risk another long sentence built on testimony from business owners and union insiders, or take a plea to cut down the uncertainty. In 2003, He chose to plead guilty to certain extortion-related offenses connected to the waterfront schemes. He did not stand up in court and describe the entire arc of his criminal career. He admitted to enough for the judge to impose a new federal term, adding several more years to the time he would spend behind bars. To the agents who had spent so many hours watching his driveway, the news was satisfying but sobering. They had succeeded, once again, in pulling him off the street. Yet they also knew from experience that putting him away did not erase the culture that had let him operate for so long. Other men would shift into some of the roles he had vacated. Some union officers would still be tempted by quiet payments. Some business owners, anxious to keep goods moving, would still believe that an off-books arrangement was preferable to a protracted fight. In prison again, he became a familiar figure within the federal system. An aging, organized crime leader who had already served major time and was now back on another racketeering-related case. Younger inmates with mob ties often treated him with deference, aware of his reputation on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. Guards and administrators saw him as someone to monitor but not necessarily fear for daily disorder. His power was rooted in the outside world, not in dramatic confrontations behind the walls. Law enforcement bulletins during these years often referred to him as a Genovese family captain incarcerated on federal charges, and noted that he retained influence in New Jersey operations despite his confinement. Visits, monitored calls, and coded letters helped him keep a sense of what was happening beyond the fences. Each interaction was scrutinized by authorities trying to limit his ability to direct serious activity from inside. But they understood that influence in such circles did not always require direct orders. The fact of his survival, his history, his continued presence as a respected elder of that world shaped how others behaved. The 2003 plea and sentence formed part of a broader crackdown on waterfront crime. Alongside his case, prosecutors brought actions against ILA officials who had taken illegal payments, shipping executives who had cooperated with extortion demands, and even some lower-level figures who had physically carried money or passed messages. The point was not only to punish individuals, but to send a message that the old assumption that the docks would always belong to the mob was no longer accepted by law enforcement. Still, the tension between image and reality persisted. On paper, reforms strengthened oversight. The Waterfront Commission continued to deny or revoke licenses for people with organized crime ties. Internal union rules were tightened. Training emphasized ethical obligations. Yet on the ground, many workers and managers believed that unspoken pressures had not disappeared, only grown more cautious. As for Fiumara, he settled once again into the rhythm of incarceration, older now, with more health issues. He knew that each stretch inside cut into what remained of his life. Yet he also knew that in his world, men who endured such punishment without cooperating with authorities were often rewarded with increased respect upon release. That calculation loyalty in exchange for status and continued profit had guided him since youth. When he walked out yet again in the mid-2000s, this time in his mid-60s, he did so into a mob landscape that had evolved but still included familiar features. The Genovese family's traditional boss, Vincent Chin Gigante, had died in 2005 while serving a long federal term. Other top leaders faced their own legal problems. In that environment, federal and state agencies believed that a loose, ruling panel of senior captains helped guide the family's day-to-day affairs. Several law enforcement assessments placed his name on that short list of senior decision-makers. They described him as a key voice for New Jersey, someone consulted on matters ranging from waterfront rackets to construction schemes and waste-hauling deals. Exact internal arrangements are always hard to prove in court, but wiretap snippets, informant reports, and observed patterns of meetings convinced investigators that he was no longer just a regional captain. He had become, at least informally, one of the men helping to steer the entire organization during a turbulent period. Evidence of this role appeared in small, consistent details. Associates from other Genovese crews in New York made regular trips across the river to see him at nondescript restaurants. Higher-ranking figures from families allied with the Genovese showed deference when they encountered him at weddings and funerals. Messages about disputes in distant neighborhoods occasionally seemed to route through his circle before any decisions were reached. He did not flaunt this status. That had never been his way. Observers who caught glimpses of him out in public in those years saw a reserved, slightly stooped man who kept his voice low and his body language controlled. He left flashier behavior to younger, less careful figures, some of whom ended up drawing far more attention from the press and the law. Still, whenever investigators mapped out the structure of organized crime in the New York, New Jersey area, his name sat high on the chart. He was linked not only to dockside schemes, but also to illegal gambling networks that stretched through bars and social clubs, sports betting lines that reached from neighborhood bookies to offshore operations, and loan sharking circles where cash moved through layers of brokers to borrowers who had nowhere else to go. The financial damage from these activities was considerable, even if most stories never reached newspapers. Workers on the docks lost trust in their own union leadership. Companies running on thin margins were burdened with secret fees that distorted competition. People who fell behind on high-interest payments found themselves trapped, paying and paying without ever seeing their debt shrink. All the while, he lived outwardly, modestly. No mansions, no exotic cars. His wealth, whatever its true extent, was dispersed through relatives, shell companies, and quiet investments. That subtlety made seizing assets harder for authorities and fit perfectly with the Genovese family's tradition of avoiding unnecessary spectacle. Yet even the most careful planner cannot avoid the wear of time. In surveillance photographs from these later years, agents noted the changes: his slower gait, the way he sometimes paused before climbing a short flight of stairs, the occasional medical appointment at cancer treatment centers. They discussed among themselves whether his body would outlast the never-ending attention from law enforcement, or whether one of those pressures would finally break first. Despite his age and health, they kept building files. Every union corruption case in the region still raised the same question. Did any path from those local wrongdoers lead back to him? Every gambler arrested running a betting operation in a Genovese neighborhood was quietly asked, off the record, who ultimately took a share. Some answered with shrugs, some feigned ignorance, and a few, under pressure, whispered that a retired Tino in New Jersey was still regarded as a man at the top. He had spent a lifetime creating that perception through firmness, through silence, through a consistent refusal to cooperate with the state. Now, as the 2000s moved toward their end, he found himself in a strange position. A man whose criminal influence had shaped a region, whose name still inspired both fear and respect in certain circles, yet who woke up each morning like any other aging resident, reaching for medication bottles, checking the weather, and wondering in his own way how many more seasons he would see. In the last years when agents watched him, the days around him looked almost ordinary. A light would flick on in the small front room before sunrise. Curtains twitched. A coffee maker gurgled. Now and then, someone shuffling past with a dog would glimpse him through the thick glasses on his face, newspaper in his hands. An older man sitting at a kitchen table. The people sitting in cars up the block saw more. They logged every visitor, every car that paused just a little too long in front of the house, every afternoon when he stepped out wearing a jacket that didn't match the weather. The reports they filed later almost always began the same way. Subject: Tino Fiumara. Observed leaving residence at. He was in his late 60s now. Time had taken his speed, not his habits. When he opened his front door, he never rushed the first step. He scanned the street in a practiced way, eyes moving, but head still. The stretch of sidewalk, the parked cars, the utility truck at the corner, each detail received a quick measure before he locked up behind him. He drove himself most days. A simple sedan, nothing that would draw notice. If a younger associate offered to take the wheel, he often waved them off with a small motion. Control, even in small things, mattered. The route he chose might vary: a different turn here, a different highway exit there, but nearly always led, in the end, towards some place where business could be discussed quietly. Sometimes it was a neighborhood restaurant that had survived several waves of change formica tables, an old jukebox, a bar lined with regulars. Other times it was a social club whose sign had faded so badly that new residents barely knew what it was. A back booth, a side room, a corner table by the window so he could see who came in before they noticed him. These became his informal offices. Agents could not hear everything said at those tables. Even with modern devices, background noise, careful seating, and the habit of speaking in low tones made clear recordings difficult. What surveillance did capture, through snippets and patterns, suggested that he remained deeply involved in the same spheres that had defined his life. The docks, construction, waste hauling, gambling, and the union locals that tied those industries together. One thing his watchers noticed was that, despite his age, people still deferred to him. Younger men who had never seen the old Newark waterfront came into those restaurants with shoulders slightly hunched, voices lower than usual. They listened more than they talked. When he spoke, they leaned in. When he ended a conversation with a brief nod, they took it as a closing instruction, even if no direct order had been given. Law enforcement sources later said that by this stage, he was viewed not just as a captain, but as one of the key senior figures in the Genovese hierarchy, part of an informal group that helped guide the family when formal leadership faced indictments or health problems. New Jersey was his domain within that system. Decisions that affected the piers, trucking firms tied to the ports, and certain large contracting jobs on his side of the river rarely moved forward without some signal that he approved. On the waterfront itself, his influence felt more than seen. Longshoremen did not expect him to show up at the gates. They heard his name in conversations between certain union officers and trusted stevedores. They saw his shadow in the way some men seemed to land the best pierhead jobs over and over, while others with clean records waited at the bottom of lists. They sensed him in company owners' sudden willingness to bend during contract talks. After weeks of resisting, through the 2000s, federal investigators pushed hard against the remaining pockets of underworld control on the docks. Operations run by the FBI, the Waterfront Commission, and state task forces focused on specific locals of the International Longshoremen's Association in New Jersey and across the harbor in New York. They looked for ghost employees on payrolls, no-show jobs assigned to relatives of known mob figures, union leaders living far beyond official salaries, and contractors who somehow always won bids despite weaker written proposals. In a string of cases, they charged ILA officers and trustees with taking bribes, embezzling union funds, or conspiring to aid extortion. Court documents described in careful detail how secret payments were routed from port-related companies to individuals who promised to steer union decisions in the right direction. When those documents reached the point of explaining who ultimately stood behind some of these schemes, the same name kept appearing: a Genovese family captain in New Jersey, identified in law enforcement summaries as Tino Fiumara. Not every allegation translated into new counts against him personally. Prosecutors often preferred to move quickly against the more exposed union officials, rather than wait until they could assemble a perfect case against the plank higher-ups. But the picture they drew piece by piece was of a continuing system in which he remained a central, guiding presence. Newer agents, who knew him at first only as a name in briefing packets, sometimes asked their older colleagues what he had actually been like in his early days. Around desks piled with files, the veterans would talk about the old Newark bars under neon beer signs, the pier parking lots in winter fog, the hiring halls where men with calloused hands stood quiet as certain names were always called first. They remembered the first big federal case that had sent him away, back in the late 1972, when the government had laid bare the extortion and racketeering that let the Genovese organization control ILA locals and pressure shipping lines. They recalled the surprise, decades earlier, when a relatively low-profile figure suddenly turned out to be at the center of such a large operation. "Careful," one old agent would always say, tapping a manila folder. That was his whole thing. Careful. Didn't yell, didn't show off, just kept at it. To understand why he was still able to wield power now, they sometimes traced his path further back for the newcomers. In Newark's iron-bound and neighboring districts during the 1960s, the line between union activism, local politics, and underworld influence could be thin. Young men looking for a way up saw that someone who knew the right figures could solve a lot of problems quickly, getting a relative onto a crew, smoothing over a fight, making sure a small business didn't get buried in unexpected troubles. Tino had started, by most accounts, doing favors and running errands for older Genovese men who already touched waterfront work. He learned how hiring lists were arranged, how grievances could be delayed or accelerated, how a word in the right ear at the right time could turn a costly slowdown into a quiet compromise. It was not glamorous, but it was powerful. Over time, as others went to prison, died, or lost favor, he moved up. By the early 1972, law enforcement intelligence reports already described him as a rising figure with close ties to ILA locals in New Jersey, involved in gambling and illegal loans, and serving as a go-between for senior Genovese leaders and the day-to-day operations on the docks. His first major conviction in the late 1970 seconds for racketeering and extortion linked to dockside unions should have ended his career. 2 long prison terms, stacked over decades, would have broken many men. Instead, among those who shared his world, they functioned almost like a twisted badge of honor. He had been hit hard by the government, gone away, kept his mouth shut, and come back. That history was part of why he still sat at the center of things now. Every time a younger associate wavered about whether to take a plea or cooperate, older Genovese men could point to his example. Years inside, no cooperation. And yet upon release, a return to status and influence. Of course, those years had done damage of another kind. While agents watched him in the 2000s, doctors were also watching him closely. Medical visits became more frequent. Some trips were to cardiologists, others to clinics known for oncology, cancer, heart trouble, whatever the exact diagnoses. His body was not the same machine that had once carried him through long, cold nights on the piers. Yet even illness did not instantly erode his position. In the underworld's unspoken calculations, a respected older figure dealing with health problems often became more valued, not less. People wanted his blessing while they could still get it. They visited more often, made sure to be seen paying respect, hoping that when he was gone, those gestures would be remembered by whoever inherited his seat at the table. Law enforcement listened in on some of those visits, hearing talk of aches and treatments mixed with updates about friends and projects that still sounded very much like business. They heard concern not only for his condition, but for the continuity of the network he had helped build. One recurring topic in those monitored conversations was money flow from construction and waste hauling. Over the years, the same skills used to dominate the docks had been applied to other fields. Union influence over building trades and trash collection offered similar leverage to that found on the piers. Slowdowns, strikes, or administrative issues could cost companies dearly. Men in his circle allegedly used that leverage to extract illegal payments, steer contracts, or insist that certain subcontractors be hired on a job. Court records from various cases in New York and New Jersey during this period described schemes in which mobile-tied carting companies won lucrative municipal contracts through bid rigging, and concrete firms associated with certain crews received favored treatment on large construction projects. Even when his name did not appear in the indictments, investigators believed that as the senior New Jersey captain, he took a share and offered protection to those involved. Another topic that surfaced frequently was gambling. Despite changes in technology and state lotteries, casinos, online betting, there was still strong demand for old-fashioned bookmaking. Many gamblers preferred dealing with a local bookmaker who advanced credit, settled weekly, and could be reached by phone without official records. These operations, often conducted out of taverns, barber shops, or small offices, remained a reliable source of profit for crews like his. Agents listening to wires in those cases heard runners talking about Tino's people, or Jersey, shorthand, suggesting that a piece of the action flowed upward to him. Arrested bookmakers sometimes confirmed privately that their lines were connected to a larger network and that certain percentages were owed upstairs, though they often avoided naming names directly on the record. The pattern repeated across loan sharking as well. Borrowers, small business owners facing cash crunches, gamblers deep in debt, people dealing with family emergencies took high-interest loans from street-level lenders attached to his crew. Payments were collected relentlessly. Those who fell behind saw late fees stack up, making it nearly impossible to escape. The pressure was psychological and financial more than openly violent, but the effect was the same: dependence and fear. By the late 2000s, the cumulative weight of his activities over a lifetime had left its mark on New Jersey's economic and social landscape. Some businesses that might have grown, invested, or hired more were instead drained by years of secret payments. Some honest union members who might have led reform movements were sidelined early in their careers for resisting the wrong people. Some families carried long memories of debts that had spiraled after a single desperate decision to take underworld money. Inside his own house, though, the atmosphere might have looked calm to an outsider. Family photos hung on walls. Relatives visited. Holidays brought food and laughter. The man at the center of so many case files could, in those private moments, seem simply like an aging uncle telling quiet stories, hearing about grandchildren, or complaining about his medications. Federal agents, reading transcripts and watching from a distance, sometimes wrestled with that contrast. They saw, in black and white, the damage done by the rackets he had overseen. They also saw, in grainy footage, the reality of his frailty. Some younger investigators, raised on dramatized versions of mob life, were surprised by how ordinary he looked. No designer suits, no bodyguards. Flanking him, no raised voices. Just a short, stout man in a windbreaker, moving carefully down his front steps. Still, they kept working. Files on his activities did not close simply because he had turned another year older or made another hospital visit. When federal prosecutors built new cases against corrupt union officers or fraudulent contractors, they still asked the same questions about whether any of those trails led back to him. When informants from the Genovese organization agreed to talk, one of the first names they were asked about was his. Even among cooperating witnesses, not everyone was willing to describe his role in detail. Some claimed they only knew of him by reputation, not direct contact. Others admitted that they had met him, but insisted that conversations had stayed vague. The respect and fear he inspired even among people now working with the government highlighted how deeply his presence was woven into their memories of that world. All the while, seasons turned. One winter, agents noticed he no longer cleared his own steps. A younger relative did it. The following summer, he spent more time inside, shades drawn against the heat. Doctor's appointments appeared more often on the surveillance logs than meetings in diners. Yet until the very end of that period, nobody on the law enforcement side assumed that he had retired from the life. In their minds, as long as he could sit at a table and nod or frown, as long as people still sought his blessing, he remained part of the structure they had spent decades trying to uproot. Then, in 2010, the rhythm they had grown used to stopped. One morning, the unmarked car on his block stayed parked only briefly. Agents had heard the news through internal channels before most neighbors did. The man they had watched age in front of them had died, reportedly of natural causes after a struggle with serious illness. There would be no more log entries about his comings and goings, no more quiet photographs through a diner window. For the agencies who had built their careers tracing his impact on the docks and beyond, his death marked the close of a long chapter, but not the end of the story that chapter had shaped. His final years might have passed in a modest house on a quiet street, yet the consequences of what he had done since his youth on the Newark waterfront continued to ripple through unions, companies, and communities that still lived with the legacy of his control. The funeral was quiet on purpose. Cars lined the street, most of them ordinary sedans and family SUVs with plates from New Jersey and New York. Men stepped out in dark suits that didn't fit quite right, shirts a little too tight around the neck or a shade off from the jacket. Women walked more slowly, some holding the arms of older relatives. A few younger faces lingered near the back, hands in pockets, trying not to be obvious as they checked who had shown up. Inside the church, the air smelled of candles and old wood. The priest spoke in gentle, general terms about sin, forgiveness, and the mysteries of life and death. He did not list occupations. He did not catalog the actions that had filled the man's days. To the few parishioners who didn't know the backstory, it looked like any other crowded farewell for a neighborhood elder. In the last pews, two men in plain clothes sat with programs folded in their hands, eyes moving in a slow pattern from row to row. They weren't there to pay respects. They were there with mental checklists: who embraced whom, who sat up front, who almost walked in, and then turned away after a glance at the parking lot. Outside, unmarked cars idled near the curb, logging plates and faces. The name on the small card at the entrance read, Tino Fiumara, 1940, 2010. There were no speeches about the docks. Nobody stood up and talked about union meetings in smoke-filled rooms or lady-night negotiations in diners, about envelopes slid across tables or frightened business owners who finally caved after weeks of pressure. The church doesn't catalog those things at the lectern, but many people in the pews, and more than a few watching from outside, knew that the man in the casket had spent 50 years shaping the hidden life of the New Jersey waterfront. After the service, the crowd spilled out onto the sidewalk. Some hugged quickly and left. Others lingered in tight circles, heads close together, voices low. One or two older men, careful with their steps, were helped into cars by younger relatives who seemed torn between grief and something like nervousness. They knew the police were watching. They knew cameras might be pointed their way from down the street. Yet they also knew that staying away would have sent its own message. A short distance away, in the front seat of one of those unmarked vehicles, a retired agent sat beside a younger colleague. He had insisted on coming, even though he no longer carried a badge. "I chased this guy half my career," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the church doors. "First time I saw him, he had black hair. Now look." The younger agent had only known Fiumara as an older man in surveillance photos and case summaries. To him, the figure in the casket was almost an abstraction, the center of a web of extortion charts and call logs. But to the retired officer, the day felt like a closing bracket on decades of early mornings at the piers, late nights writing reports, long stretches sitting in cars like this one watching that same stocky frame move through shadows. The obituary that ran in the local paper was brief. It listed relatives, church affiliations, and a handful of bland details. There was no mention of the federal racketeering convictions, the decades in prison, or the repeated references to his name in court documents describing union corruption and organized crime control over the ports. That history lived instead in case files, news archives, and the memories of longshoremen who had spent their working lives under a system shaped by people like him. When someone like Fiumara dies, the underworld does not close for mourning the way a store might. Rackets don't politely pause. Money still needs to move, debts still need to be collected, union elections still need to be steered. The question, in the weeks after his burial, was who would take up the roles he had filled, and whether they would hold the docks with the same firm, quiet grip. Law enforcement analysts drew diagrams on whiteboards with his name at the top of one section. Waterfront Rackets, New Jersey Division. Beneath it, they wrote the names of lieutenants believed to have run specific pieces of the business: gambling, loans, trucking, union contacts. Lines ran from there down to others: foremen, stewards, company insiders, freelance toughs who turned up when words weren't enough. With Tino gone, someone would rise to the top of that chart. The names of likely successors had been on internal lists for years. Some were men who had grown up in Bayonne or Elizabeth, watching older relatives navigate the port. Others were from across the river, figures who had cut their teeth in Manhattan or the Bronx, but had been sent to New Jersey to help manage things as federal pressure increased. The Genovese family, by tradition, hated public drama. It favored smooth transitions, low wowky promotions, and as little visible conflict as possible. That did not mean there was never anger or rivalry below the surface. In private, men argued over how money from the docks should be divided, which companies should be favored, who should be allowed to sit at meetings once reserved for an older group. But the family's long-standing culture demanded that such disputes be handled quietly. Flashy violence drew attention. They had seen what spectacular gangland wars had done to other families over the years, and they had no interest in repeating those mistakes. So even if there were dark conversations in certain back rooms after his death, little of it spilled into the open. Business owners did not suddenly see a dozen new faces demanding cash. Longshoremen did not wake up to find chaos at the gates. Changes came, but in a way that let the old routines continue almost seamlessly. From the perspective of the longshoremen who had worked the cranes and holds through the 1,980 seconds, 1,990 seconds, and 2000s, his death was less about daily operations and more about the fading of an era. Many of the younger workers coming onto the docks after 2010 had never heard his name. Their battles were with new forms of job insecurity, automation, casualized labor, complex subcontracting chains. The idea of a single man, answerable to an old line crime family, calling plays over which companies got squeezed and which men worked the best shifts, seemed less concrete to them than to those who remembered the 1,970 seconds hiring halls. Yet the structures he had helped set up or reinforce did not vanish. Some ILA locals in New Jersey still had officers whose careers had been quietly supported by the Genovese organization. Some party-linked contractors still operated with habits formed in the days when refusing a consulting deal meant long delays at the gates. The past leaves systems behind, not just stories. Within federal agencies, after the funeral, attention shifted gently but noticeably from the man to the model. Analysts spent time turning his history into training material. Newer investigators were told to study how he had worked, not with dramatic shootouts or flamboyant threats, but through careful pressure on vital choke points: unions, trucking, waste, construction. They were warned that the next version of him would likely follow the same low-profile path. As they did that, some of the older agents brought out copies of files from the years when his rise had first drawn serious attention, filling in details that younger colleagues only vaguely knew. They talked about the late 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds, when the port still operated with a mix of old-fashioned cargo handling and newer containers. Bales, crates, and pallets came off ships by the thousands, each one representing goods that had to be moved without loss, damage, or delay. On the surface, union rules governed who worked where and under what conditions. Beneath that surface, men like Tino ensured that labor peace came at a price. A shipping line that wanted predictable schedules would find itself nudged, gently at first, toward hiring certain trucking firms, using particular warehouse operators, or making underthitable payments for labor relations consulting. Things ran smoothly. If they resisted, they discovered that even small bureaucratic slowdowns, a late crew call here, a paperwork glitch there, could cost a fortune. The earliest serious investigation that touched him directly had focused on precisely this pattern. Federal agents spent months watching pier gates and union offices, noting which foremen seemed to hold unusual sway and which visitors from outside the official structure always seemed to be present when disputes were settled. They followed envelopes from company boardrooms to back rooms in bars. Bit by bit, they built a case showing how he and other Genovese figures used their influence over ILA locals to extract illegal payments from businesses desperate to keep freight moving. That case led to his first long prison sentence, the one handed down in the late 1,970 seconds. It charged him not only with plain extortion, but with being part of a racketeering enterprise, a way of saying that his actions were not isolated hustles, but pieces of a broader organized crime system. The conviction was a major moment for law enforcement on the East Coast, a rare instance in which a high-level but low-profile figure on the docks had been successfully tied to a pattern of criminal acts. Over the years that followed, other investigations broadened that picture. Informants who had lived in his orbit told grand juries about his crew's involvement in illegal sports betting numbers, games that had once been neighborhood pastimes, later growing into multi-state operations anchored by bookmakers who answered indirectly to him. They described loan-sharking schemes in which his people advanced cash at crippling interest to gamblers and small business owners, then leaned on them for payments week after week. Some witnesses, usually under heavy protection, linked him by rumor or hearsay to cases of lethal violence within the underworld itself, particularly around disputes over who controlled the Bayonne and Newark waterfront territories after other Genovese figures ran into legal trouble. One mob associate who eventually cooperated with the government said in a sealed statement that when a rival dockside leader disappeared in the late 1,980 seconds, nobody needed to be told who backed that move. But statements like that, without hard evidence, rarely became formal charges, so his official record remained focused on financial crimes. The absence of murder convictions didn't change how people in his world calculated risk. When a truck company owner sat across from one of his intermediaries, they weren't thinking about legal technicalities. They were thinking about the man's reputation for enforcing discipline inside his own organization, about stories whispered in union break rooms, about the number of people who had crossed him and then quietly lost positions, contracts, or, in a few infamous cases, their freedom or their lives. Respect and fear are often entwined in such places. After his death, some crime historians and reporters tried to sum up his legacy in a few paragraphs. They noted that he had come up under older Genovese leaders, that he had spent much of his prime in federal prisons, and that he had outlasted many contemporaries who had either cooperated with authorities or been removed violently. They emphasized that for decades, law enforcement bulletins had routinely named him as one of the key figures in the New Jersey branch of the Genovese family. A man consulted on matters that stretched far beyond the docks. Union reformers, especially within the ILA, saw his passing as an opportunity but not a cure. They publicly acknowledged that past leadership had been compromised by organized crime influence and pledged stronger internal controls, more transparent elections, and tougher ethics oversight. Some longshore locals began working more closely with the Waterfront Commission and federal monitors to screen out applicants with serious organized crime ties from sensitive positions. Results were mixed. In some terminals, Genuine progress broke long-standing patterns. Rank-and-D file workers saw fewer mysterious no-show jobs positions assigned to individuals who did not actually work, but collected a paycheck as a favor. In others, changes were slower. Quiet deals, old loyalties, and a lingering belief that this is just how the port works made reform uneven. For the families of people harmed by the system he had helped maintain, there was no single moment of closure. Unlike victims in more visible crimes, many had suffered slowly. Years of being passed over for honest promotions, of paying hidden surcharges to survive in a rigged business environment, of seeing a relative drift into debt with underworld lenders, and never truly escape. His death did not refund the money or restore the lost opportunities. Inside enforcement agencies, his photo gradually moved from active bulletin boards to historical files. New names replaced his on organizational charts, tracking Genovese's influence in New Jersey. Yet trainers still pulled out his story for new recruits. They pointed to how long he had evaded major convictions, how much damage he had done through crimes that did not involve shootouts or headlines, just pressure on the right points in the economy. They also used his life to push back against romanticized notions of mob existence. The reality, they reminded young agents, looked less like movies and more like this: an adolescent from a working-class neighborhood drawn into a network that promised faster money and local power, decades of quiet extortion, unreported threats, and political manipulation. Long stretches in prison cells, an old age spent under surveillance, walking slowly out of small restaurants, checking over his shoulder even on ordinary streets. For all the money that had flowed through his hands, he did not die in a mansion. He did not leave behind a corporation with his name on the side, or a foundation funding good works. He left a modest house, a reputation in certain circles, and a network of corrupted systems that others quickly stepped in to run. The piers, cranes, and container yards went on without him. Ships docked, were unloaded, and departed. Longshoremen punched in, worked their shifts, and went home. Union meetings continued, sometimes under brighter lights than before, sometimes not. The shadow he had cast over that world had lifted in one sense, but the habits and structures formed under it remained, challenging a new generation to decide whether they would finally finish what earlier investigations had only partially begun. For the retired agent who had watched the funeral from the unmarked car, that was the part that stuck with him. He had not spent his career chasing one man's story, just to close it like a book when that man's heart stopped. He had done it because of the everyday harm the prices raised quietly to cover illegal payments, the workers pushed aside because they wouldn't play along, the small businesses that withered under debts they should never have owed. Driving away from the church that day, he looked once more in the rearview mirror at the crowd still gathered on the sidewalk. Then he turned the corner, heading back not into active duty, but into a retirement where the name Tino would always stand for something larger than any individual. The long, often hidden reach of organized crime into the lives of people who never chose that world, but had to live in the one it bent around itself. After the funeral, after the last cars had pulled away from the curb, and the church doors were locked, files with his name on the cover stayed open on desks, far from that quiet street. You could stand at one of those desks, flip through the pages, and watch his life play out not as memories but as evidence. Photographs, transcripts, bank records, union minutes, handwritten notes from agents who had retired or died. Together they formed the clearest picture that would ever exist of what Tino Fiumara had actually done. The first thick section in most of those binders came from the 1,970 seconds. At that time, the New Jersey side of New York Harbor was a world of its own. Bayonne, Newark, Jersey City, Port Elizabeth docks crowded with ships, warehouses stacked with goods, trucks lined up along narrow roads. The International Longshoremen's Association had powerful locals there, with officers who controlled access to some of the best-paying blue-collar work in the region. On paper, those locals were simply labor organizations representing workers in contract negotiations. In practice, federal agencies came to believe that some of them served as tools for the Genovese crime family. Men like Fiumara stood in the space between shipping companies, union leaders, and the street. Agents who worked those early cases later described how the investigation started with small oddities, companies complaining informally that their trucks seemed to be delayed more often than others, workers hinting that they had to kick up part of their pay, union elections where certain candidates always dropped out at just the right moment. Nothing by itself proved a crime, but patterns were there. It took wiretaps, hidden microphones, and a few brave informants to turn those patterns into proof. Undercover agents sat in bars near the piers with tiny recorders hidden under their clothes. They listened, night after night, to talk about settling disputes, about money that had to be collected before certain holidays, about who would be taken care of for delivering votes in a union meeting. In those recordings and later testimony, investigators began hearing the same name in connection with New Jersey operations: Tino, not the boss of the entire Genovese family, but the man trusted to manage a major piece of its business on the waterfront. Someone who made sure that money flowed upward, and that problems with stubborn companies or rebellious union men were handled. The big break came when prosecutors assembled a case that tied specific payments from shipping and trucking firms to specific acts of pressure. Company executives described how they had been approached by men who hinted at future labor trouble if they didn't agree to consulting arrangements. After those executives agreed to pay, slowdowns vanished. Cargo moved. When they briefly tried to stop paying, delays mysteriously returned until they resumed. Union insiders testified about how hiring lists were manipulated at the direction of people outside the official leadership. Men connected to his crew were placed in key positions as foremen or shop stewards. They could, with a few phone calls, ensure that a company which played ball always had enough workers, while another that resisted found itself short-staffed at crucial times. When the indictment in that case was unsealed near the end of the 1,970 seconds, the charges spelled out the government's theory that Fiumara and his associates had used their control of ILA locals and influence over union officers to extort regular illegal payments from businesses at the Port of New York and New Jersey in violation of federal racketeering and extortion laws. Alongside his name, the charging document listed other known Genovese figures, including Johnny D. DiGilio, another New Jersey waterfront power. The two men were, in those years, at the center of the mob's grip on the Bayani area piers. Their crews handled bookmaking, loans, and the enforcement of the labor peace that companies had learned to buy. The trial that followed in federal court was the first time many residents of New Jersey heard his name. Local newspapers ran sketches of him at the defense table, describing a stocky man with a reserved expression, sitting near DiGilio and other defendants. Prosecutors laid out the story of life on the docks from their perspective. The quiet threats, the demanded salaries for no-show jobs, the union power used as a weapon for private gain. Witnesses, some of them former allies now under protection, described meetings in back rooms where shipping executives were told in careful language that it would be in their interest to make certain payments. They talked about union elections where candidates seen as too independent were encouraged to drop out, sometimes with gentle persuasion, sometimes with stronger pressure. In the end, the jury convicted him on major counts. The judge, looking at the length of the scheme and the amount of money involved, imposed a substantial sentence. The records from that day show the formal language, but reporters present noted the judge's frustration at the damage done to honest workers and companies by the corruption exposed in court. Even before he began serving that term, though, another event would deepen his reputation in the underworld, and in law enforcement's view, reveal something about how internal discipline worked in his world. In 1988, John DiGilio disappeared. He had been a dominant figure on the Bayonne waterfront, long associated with Genovese operations there, and had faced his own share of legal trouble. Months after he went missing, his body was found in the Hackensack River. The killing was widely understood, in both mob circles and law enforcement, as an internal act, not a random crime, but a targeted removal. Rumors swirled that DiGilio had been skimming money or causing unwanted attention. Investigators suspected that other Genovese leaders in New Jersey, including Fiumara, had approved or even ordered his elimination to settle disputes over control of waterfront rackets. But rumors are not evidence. No one was ever tried in court for that crime, and his name never appeared on an indictment for it. Still, the story hardened perceptions. In confidential debriefings with informants, agents kept hearing the same suggestion. After DiGilio's death, no one doubted that the surviving leadership, with Tino prominent among them, would not hesitate to remove even a powerful insider who threatened their control. That belief strengthened the aura around him. You did not have to raise your voice or make direct threats when everyone already knew what your world was capable of. The next major wave of cases that would bear his name began in the late 1900s 990 seconds, and early 2000s, after he was released from his first long sentence, and then returned for violating parole by associating with known felons. During that period, federal agents and the Waterfront Commission renewed their focus on specific ILA locals in New Jersey, particularly those connected to container terminals in Newark and Elizabeth. They found that even after 2 decades of prosecutions, many of the old patterns had survived in subtler form. Companies involved in trucking containers from the port reported that they were under stress to hire certain firms, sign particular consulting contracts, or send regular cash payments to individuals who had no official role in their businesses. One federal case from the early 2000s, for which he eventually pleaded guilty, involved the extortion of a trucking company operating in and around the port. According to court papers, representatives of his crew approached the company with warnings about potential problems with labor and access if they did not agree to pay thousands of dollars regularly. The company paid, afraid of what might happen if they refused. Investigators later persuaded key insiders to cooperate, recording conversations and documenting cash drops. When that case was unsealed, prosecutors again presented him as the primary beneficiary. Even if he did not take the envelopes in person, witnesses said they understood that the money flowed through intermediaries to him as the Genovese captain overseeing that territory. Facing the weight of the evidence and his own record, he took a plea deal rather than go through a full public trial, adding more years behind bars to the time already served. Alongside that trucking case, other prosecutions targeted ILA officers who were accused of taking bribes to favor certain companies or to look the other way as mob-linked firms obtained jobs and contracts. In several of those matters, charged union officials told investigators that they had received encouragement or pressure from higher-ranking Genovese figures. His name appeared repeatedly as someone whose wishes they felt bound to respect, even if they never dealt with him face-to-face. Through this period, one contrast stood out for people who studied organized crime. While in other families many senior leaders had become cooperating witnesses, the Genovese group retained a core of old-guard men who refused to talk, and he was among them. Where high-profile figures from other families, like Sammy Gravano in the Gambino organization, had taken the stand and described ceremonies and murders in detail, no similar betrayal came from his level of the Genovese structure. That refusal to cooperate came with a price: more prison time, a life of constant scrutiny, an old age spent under supervision, but it also reinforced the family's ability to weather law enforcement pressure. Younger Genovese members, facing choices about whether to cut deals, saw what had happened to men who flipped in other families. New identities, yes, but also isolation, mistrust, and in some cases continued legal and personal troubles. In contrast, they saw Fiumara, a man who had gone away, served hard time, and still returned to a position of influence. For the people he harmed, that loyalty to his criminal code offered no comfort. A trucker who paid illegal fees for years saw nothing romantic in the fact that the person behind the scheme stuck to old-world notions of silence. A longshoreman passed over of promotion because he wouldn't socialize with the right crowd, did not view the organizer of that system as a man of honor. But inside the criminal culture itself, those choices shaped how others behaved. Outside the tight circles around the docks and the case files in federal buildings, most residents of New Jersey knew his world more through fiction than fact. Television dramas about New Jersey mob families borrowed heavily from real investigations into ILA locals and waterfront racketeering. Episodes centered on crooked union deals, no-show jobs on the piers, waste-hauling scams, and pressure on contractors came straight from newspaper archives and court documents that had featured his name and those of his associates. Writers did not usually use his actual name, but they drew on the type of figure he represented. The low-key, older captain whose influence stretched from the ports to construction to gambling, who dressed plainly, avoided cameras, and preferred to talk business in small neighborhood joints. Viewers saw a dramatized version. Investigators and longshoremen recognized pieces of real life. The gap between those dramatizations and the day-to-day reality mattered. In fiction, scenes tended to peak with flamboyant confrontations. In real life, as shown in his history, most of the harm came from repeated, almost bureaucratic acts, a percentage added quietly to an invoice, a union rule enforced in a way that punished one company and spared another. A worker's name quietly moved down a list. Violence remained in the background as an implied threat, But the crimes that built his influence were mostly economic and administrative. By the time of his death, federal and state reforms had begun to reduce the scope of what someone like him could do. The Waterfront Commission's licensing rules kept some known figures away from sensitive positions. RICO laws allowed prosecutors to hold leaders responsible for patterns of crime rather than only for isolated acts. Monitors were installed in certain unions to oversee elections and finances. Yet none of those tools had stopped him completely while he lived. He had found ways, within the cracks of the system, to keep exerting pressure through relatives with clean formal records, associates who avoided official union posts, business fronts that looked legitimate on paper. For younger investigators coming into organized crime squads after his death, his story served as a long case study in adaptability. He had grown up in an age of stevedores and sacks of cargo, learned the business of extortion and union control there, then adjusted his methods as the waterfront moved to containers, computerized scheduling, and more private security. When the law tightened in one area, he shifted to another, from docks to construction, from direct contact with union officers to using middlemen, which meant, in turn, that the real legacy of his career extended beyond the dates on his gravestone. It lived on in the lessons law enforcement drew from his cases, in the reforms unions and port authorities slowly adopted, and in the quiet determination of a new generation, both in government and on the docks, not to let another man like him weave himself so deeply into the machinery of a region's economy again. At the same time, the effects of what he had already done could still be felt, long after he was gone. Companies burdened by decades of under-the-table costs had stunted their growth. Workers shaped by years of mistrust toward their own union officials found it hard to believe in new leaders. Neighborhoods once dependent on port jobs watched some of that work move elsewhere, partly because of global trends, partly because corruption had made some terminals less competitive. Those long shadows formed the backdrop for everything that happened after his funeral on the piers, in the boardrooms, and in the offices where investigators, union reformers, and community leaders tried to decide, consciously or not, how much of the old waterfront world they were finally ready to leave behind. Years after his burial, the piers where he had once walked looked different again. Cranes stretched higher. Computers tracked containers that once would have been counted with clipboards and shouted numbers. Security cameras watched the gates. Many of the bars where deals had been whispered were gone, replaced by warehouses or parking lots. One afternoon, near the Port Newark entrance, a young longshore worker in a hard hat waited for a ride at the end of his shift. Beside him, an older man with a weathered face and a faded union jacket leaned against the railing, looking out at the rows of stacked containers. "You ever hear of Tino?" the older man asked, without looking over. The younger one shrugged. "Guy from the shows?" he said. The older man snorted once quietly. "No. Real guy. Used to run things around here. Long time back." He didn't say much more. Years of keeping quiet about certain names had become a reflex. But that brief exchange captured something that had changed since the days when Tino Fiumara's presence weighed on every hiring list and contract discussion. His name no longer automatically meant something to the newest men on the docks. For those who did know the story, it began in a Newark where the harbor was already a place of opportunity and danger. As a teenager in the late 1952s, he had watched older Genovese figures visit neighborhood bars and union halls, quietly deciding which families got regular work and which businesses were left alone. He saw that the official rules written in union bylaws were only part of the picture. Unwritten rules, enforced by men no one elected, mattered just as much. He attached himself to that structure early. At first he ran errands, carried messages, collected small debts, passed along envelopes. The work was simple, but it let him see how influence functioned. Who got the best peer assignments? Which shop steward could be counted on to push or delay a grievance? Which company manager would fold quickest when confronted with a threat dressed up as friendly advice? Over time, the tasks he handled grew larger. He became a key link between Genovese leaders in New York and their operations in New Jersey. He helped manage illegal betting operations that ran out of back rooms, taking wagers on ball games and horse races. He supervised loans at steep, illegal interest to gamblers and shopkeepers who needed fast money. Most importantly, he expanded the use of union power as a lever over businesses, the pattern that would define his criminal life. Investigators later pieced together how that pattern worked in detail. In one example reconstructed from testimony, a mid-sized trucking firm based near the port, saw its work suddenly become chaotic. Drivers were left waiting for hours to pick up loads. Crews assigned to load their trailers were late or incomplete. Clerical mistakes appeared on their paperwork. When managers called union offices, they heard vague explanations about problems and confusion. Within weeks, a man connected to Fiumara's circle appeared at their offices. He suggested that, for a regular fee, he could help smooth things out. The message was indirect but unmistakable. Pay, and the delays would end. Don't pay, and the confusion would likely get worse. That was extortion, even if no one in the room used the word. It was not a single dramatic robbery, but a continuing demand backed by the ability to cause trouble through union channels. Similar situations occurred at warehouse companies, maintenance outfits, and other firms tied to the port. Some resisted and went to the authorities. Many more quietly paid. A central part of his power came from his influence over specific locals of the International Longshoremen's Association. He did not hold office in the union. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he cultivated relationships with officers and delegates. When internal union elections approached, his associates would signal which candidates they supported. Those candidates usually found their campaigns well-funded and strangely free of obstacles. Rivals encountered sudden difficulties, jobs reassigned, rumors spread, unexpected rules invoked. Once loyalists held key posts, they could steer hiring, overtime, and disciplinary procedures in ways that served his interests. A worker who complained publicly about irregularities might find himself on less desirable shifts. A company that had cooperated could be quietly rewarded with fewer grievances and smoother scheduling. From the outside, it all looked like the normal rough and tumble of labor relations. Underneath, money moved. That hidden structure was what federal prosecutors sought to expose when they brought the first major racketeering case against him in the late 1972. In that case, they charged that he and others had used their sway over ILA locals and longshore hiring to force shipping and trucking companies to make regular illegal payments. The trial brought out stories that had been whispered on the docks for years. One union insider described being instructed to put certain men on the shape-up line for the best jobs, even if they were less reliable than others. Another recalled being told that if he supported a particular contract position, the family would see to it that he was taken care of later. Company executives spoke of meetings where men suggested that labor issues might go away in exchange for consulting fees far larger than any real advice would justify. They talked about the unspoken sense that behind the soft language lay a network of people ready to make good on implied threats. That case ended with convictions and a long sentence for Tino. For nearly 2 decades, he lived behind federal walls, while other Genovese figures filled his role on the docks. Yet his memory did not fade. On the inside, he built a reputation as someone who would not cooperate with authorities. Outside, his name remained shorthand for old-style waterfront control. When he was released and then violated parole by returning to his old contacts, the renewed investigations showed that he had not decided to walk away. Instead, according to those later cases, he re-entered the same line of work, this time even more cautious about avoiding direct contact with obvious targets. In the early 2000s, a fresh indictment described a scheme in which a trucking company serving the ports was again pressured to make monthly cash payments. This time, the crew collecting the money was smaller and more insulated. Intermediaries did much of the visible work. But cooperating witnesses said they understood that the ultimate authority behind the demands was the same New Jersey captain, him. Along the way, his crew continued to run gambling and loan operations. Bookmakers under his umbrella took sports bets in bars from Elizabeth to Jersey City. They settled weekly, feeding a percentage of their profits up the chain. Street-level lenders advanced money at double-digit weekly interest to people with no access to bank loans. Collectors made regular rounds, reminding borrowers that falling behind would have consequences. Official documents describe these actions mainly as part of financial coercion and racketeering, not as dramatic acts of violence, but the fear people felt was real. Law enforcement also believed he had a hand, directly or indirectly, in decisions to remove troublesome figures within his own world. The death of fellow Genovese waterfront boss John DeGilio in 1988, following internal friction over Bayonne rackets, stood out. No charge ever tied him to that crime. But many informants later suggested that a move of that magnitude on the New Jersey docks would not have happened without the knowledge and approval of Tino and others at his level. Looking back from the vantage point after his death, analysts often divided his life into phases. Apprenticeship under older mobsters in the 1,960 seconds. Ascent to key control of dockside rackets in the 1,970 seconds. Long imprisonment in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. Renewed activity and senior leadership in the 2000s. And gradual decline due to age and illness, leading up to 2010. Across all those phases, certain threads remained constant. He preferred quiet conversations to public displays. He understood that real leverage often came not from overt threats, but from the ability to create or resolve problems within seemingly legitimate systems, hiring procedures, contract negotiations, inspection schedules. He treated loyalty to his criminal associates as non-negotiable, even when that meant accepting long prison sentences. And he saw unions and regulated industries not as ends in themselves, but as tools through which money and influence could be extracted. The consequences of that approach were felt most sharply by people who never met him. An honest longshore worker who refused to cozy up to crew members connected to his world might watch, year after year, as less capable colleagues with the right friendships were handed premium assignments. A small warehouse company that chose not to sign a shady consulting deal could find itself mired in inspection delays and staffing headaches, while a competitor that paid moved ahead. A gambler who fell behind with a bookmaker in his network might spend years handing over most of each paycheck just to keep collectors from knocking again. Those stories rarely made the news. They surface later in courtrooms, or in interviews with retired workers, or in the recollections of agents reading between the lines of dusty surveillance transcripts. At the same time, his career helped push changes that outlasted him. Union members, especially in ports burned by repeated scandals, began pressing harder for transparent elections, audited finances, and outside oversight of hiring. Some ILA locals brought in independent monitors, or adopted stricter internal ethics rules. When names linked to organized crime appeared on candidate lists or staff rosters, they faced greater scrutiny than they once would have. Government bodies, for their part, refined their tools. The Waterfront Commission used licensing power more aggressively to block individuals with clear, organized crime ties from holding sensitive posts. Racketeering statutes allowed prosecutors to present juries with complete pictures of long-running schemes rather than having to pretend each extortion act existed in isolation. Civil suits by companies that had been victimized sometimes recovered at least a portion of what had been lost. None of that erased what he had done, but it meant that the next young man thinking about taking his place would face a different landscape. More cameras, more audits, more colleagues willing to call an investigator instead of quietly paying. Back at the port as the years rolled on, the older longshoreman who had asked, "You ever hear of Tino?" eventually retired. New cranes went up, new contracts were signed. Some of the old suspicions around union offices began to soften as leadership turned over, and a generation that had not grown up under direct mob influence took more seats on executive boards. In training rooms far from the waterfront, instructors still projected his photo on screens for new organized crime squads. They explained how one person could, over a lifetime, shape the inner workings of unions, businesses, and neighborhoods without ever holding public office or starring in headlines. They pointed to timelines on the wall showing how long such influence could last when supported by fear, silence, and a steady flow of illegal cash. And in houses across New Jersey, his story was sometimes told in private, from parents to children, in a very different tone, not as a legend, but as a warning. About the cousin who took easy money handling bets for one of his bookmakers and ended up with a record that closed doors for decades. About the uncle whose trucking company never recovered after years of paying off schemes linked back to his crew. About the grandfather who worked the piers for 30 years, kept his head down, and still never trusted the union officials he believed answered to men like Tino. Those conversations, stripped of glamour, brought his life's impact down to what mattered most: choices and their costs. He had chosen, as a young man, to align himself with the Genovese family's waterfront interests. He had chosen, again and again, to expand those interests through crime-extorting companies, corrupting union processes, running illegal betting and loan operations, overseeing a system that traded fear for money. He had chosen not to cooperate when caught, accepting repeated prison terms in exchange for status in that world. The system he helped build had offered him power, money, and a certain respect from others inside it. It had also given him years in cells, a life lived under surveillance, and an old age shadowed by law enforcement files and medical charts. When he finally died in 2010, his name left the active lists and moved into history. But the story those lists told of how a single person, working quietly in the corners of unions and companies, could bend an entire region's economy toward crime remained, waiting for anyone willing to read it closely and take from it whatever lesson they needed. On the docks, the younger worker who had shrugged at his name climbed into a car and headed home, thinking more about his next shift than about men he had never met. The older one watched him go, then turned back toward the cranes, remembering a time when a different kind of shadow hung over the harbor. The wind off the bay carried the faint sounds of engines and metal. Ships came and went. Contracts rose and fell. The water, which had reflected his rise and fall for 50 years, moved on without him, as it always does, leaving behind only the marks people choose to see and the ones they work hard enough to erase. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Tino Fiumara here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through power, loyalty, and the hidden workings of a man who ruled from the shadows. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.